There is a moment most people never see coming, not because it arrives without warning, but because every warning that came before it was mistaken for something else. The job disappears, the relationship ends. The version of the future you had quietly been building in your mind simply stops being available. And standing in the silence that follows, a thought arrives with complete conviction. I am broken. And here is where almost everyone stops looking. Because broken feels like a conclusion, like the final word on something that can no longer be argued with. And once the mind accepts it as conclusion, it stops asking the question that actually matters. What exactly is breaking? Not everything, though it feels that way. Not your capacity for honesty, not your ability to reflect, not the values you held even before the loss arrived. Something is breaking, but the thing breaking in the thing you are may not be the same thing at all. What if the pain you are carrying right now is not evidence that something essential in you has failed? What if it is evidence of something far more specific? Something that was never actually you, but that you had quietly mistaken for yourself over a very long period of time. What if the structure breaking was always supposed to break? Not because life is cruel, but because you had finally outgrown it, and the only way forward required something to come apart first. Today we are going to look closely at what is actually happening when everything feels like it is falling apart. Not as a motivational reframe, not as a way of softening genuine pain, but as an honest examination of what Stoic philosophy has understood about human suffering for centuries. That what feels like destruction is sometimes the only process through which something genuinely stronger can be built. Most people never question the story. The job ends and the mind immediately constructs a verdict. Not simply that a circumstance has changed, but that something essential has been proven. The relationship dissolves, and within hours, sometimes within minutes, a narrative is already forming. Not that a particular connection has concluded, but that something about you specifically invited the ending. This is the pattern worth examining carefully, because the story is not the same thing as what actually happened. And confusing the two is precisely where the deepest suffering begins. Here is the mechanism worth understanding clearly. The moment genuine loss arrives, the brain does not pause to evaluate what has actually occurred. It shifts almost immediately into something resembling threat mode. This is not a failure of character. It is simply how the nervous system responds when something it has been using as an anchor suddenly disappears. Attention narrows sharply. Thinking becomes less expansive. And the mind stops scanning for possibilities, fixating instead entirely on the absence of what once felt solid. In this narrowed state, three responses tend to take over almost automatically. Self-pity offers a strange temporary comfort. If the situation is simply unfair, if you have been specifically targeted by circumstance, then nothing more is required except enduring it. This feels considerably easier in the moment than asking what the difficulty might actually be revealing. Numbness offers a different kind of protection. Simply stop feeling. Let the days pass without processing what happened. Fill every quiet moment before genuine reflection has any chance to occur. And avoidance completes the pattern, reaching for distraction before the silence can ask anything of you. None of these responses are chosen consciously. They arrive before conscious choice has any real opportunity to intervene. The nervous system selects the path of least immediate pain, which is almost never the path that leads anywhere worth going. Consider what this looks like across ordinary life. Someone loses a position they held for years, and almost immediately their sense of personal value seems to vanish alongside the role itself, as though the title had been quietly holding their entire sense of self in place. And without it, there is nothing solid remaining. The practical loss is real, but watch what happens next. The mind does not stop at registering a changed circumstance. It reaches immediately for a conclusion about what the loss means, about what it proves, about who this person therefore must be. Someone experiences the end of a relationship that once felt foundational, and the ending does not register simply as a changed connection. It registers as fracture, as though their own capacity for love or steadiness or being genuinely known has broken alongside the relationship itself. Someone sits within family pressure, unable to express what they actually feel, watching the same tension repeat without resolution, until the silence stops feeling like restraint and starts feeling like erasure, like evidence that who they actually are has never been safe enough to bring fully into the room. The pain in each of these experiences is completely real. Nothing being said here minimizes it, but look carefully at what the mind is doing beneath the surface of each story. In every case, a specific external event has been translated into a sweeping verdict about identity. A changed circumstance has become proof of permanent inadequacy. A structural collapse has been read as evidence that the person standing inside it has collapsed as well. And that translation, that leap from event to verdict, is where the most persistent suffering does not simply accompany the loss, but extends far beyond it, living on long after the original event has passed, sustained entirely by a story the mind constructed in its most frightened, most narrowed state. Ask yourself something honestly. When you say you feel broken, what are you actually describing? Not the feeling itself, which is real and requires no defense, but the specific thing you believe has broken. Because that belief, unexamined, is doing an enormous amount of quiet work inside you right now, shaping every thought about what recovery might look like, every assumption about what remains possible, every decision about whether moving forward is even worth attempting. Here is what deserves careful examination. When the job ended, when the relationship dissolved, when the silence in that room became unbearable, something genuinely collapsed. But what collapsed was not your essence. It was a structure, a particular arrangement of roles, expectations, and identity that you had been living inside for long enough that it no longer felt like a structure at all. It felt like you. This is the distinction worth sitting with carefully. A container breaking is not the same thing as its contents being destroyed. Human nature makes this distinction almost impossible to feel in the moment, because human beings are wired to attach their sense of security to structure itself. This tendency did not emerge randomly. For most of human history, having a stable, recognized position within a community was not simply comfortable. It was genuinely necessary for survival. The person without a clear role, without a predictable place in the social order, was genuinely more vulnerable to everything that threatened human life in that environment. So the brain learned across countless generations to treat structural stability as safety itself, and the disappearance of structure as danger itself. This means that when the title disappears, the nervous system is not simply registering a change in employment. It is registering something that feels biologically closer to exile. When the relationship ends, the nervous system is not simply processing a changed connection. It is processing something that feels closer to being cast out from safety entirely. The pain is disproportionate to the external event, not because you are fragile, but because an ancient part of your mind is responding to loss of structure the way it was designed to respond, as though the loss were a direct threat to your continued existence. Beneath this, three emotional forces tend to surface simultaneously, compounding each other in ways that make the experience feel far larger than any single loss alone could account for. Grief arrives first, honest and necessary, mourning what genuinely existed and now does not. But grief rarely arrives alone. Shame follows closely, a quieter, more corrosive presence, whispering that the collapse itself proves something damning, that the structure fell not simply because circumstances changed, but because something in you specifically invited or deserved its falling. Fear of the future joins next, projecting the absence of this particular structure forward, imagining every way this loss might permanently limit what remains possible, as though the map of your life had been redrawn overnight, and every route worth taking had been quietly removed. And finally, beneath all three, a profound sense of lost control settles over everything. The unsettling recognition that something significant was taken without permission, without warning, and without any meaningful say in the matter. When grief, shame, fear, and lost control rise together, the mind stops processing the actual event and begins constructing something else entirely. A worst-case narrative that feels more vivid, more certain, more authoritative than the more measured reality sitting quietly underneath it. And this is the precise mechanism worth naming clearly. The structure broke, but the mind interpreted the breaking as evidence that you yourself had broken. That interpretation, not the original event, is where the most persistent suffering actually lives. The Stoics did not speak about suffering from a comfortable distance. Marcus Aurelius wrote his private reflections during plague, during war, during years of sustained difficulty that most people will never be asked to carry. Epictetus developed his entire philosophy while enslaved, his body not his own, his circumstances entirely outside his control. Seneca wrote his most enduring work under the threat of execution, knowing his life could end at any moment by order of the emperor he served. These were not men theorizing about suffering from safety. They were men thinking clearly inside it. And what they arrived at, from three entirely different starting points, converges on the same understanding. The breaking is not the problem. What you believe the breaking means is the problem. Marcus Aurelius returned repeatedly in his private writing to a specific image. Fire does not merely consume what it touches, it transforms it. The iron that enters fire does not emerge destroyed. It emerges as something the fire could not have produced without the heat. He applied this understanding directly to adversity. What stands in the way, he wrote, becomes the way. The difficulty is not blocking the path forward. It is the actual material the path is being built from. Look at what this means for the structure that collapsed inside you, the role that ended, the relationship that dissolved, the version of the future that is no longer available. These are not obstacles positioned between you and your path. They are the raw material your path is currently being constructed from. whether or not it feels that way while you are standing inside the heat. Epictetus drew a line that deserves careful attention. A line between two categories that most people spend their lives unconsciously collapsing into: one, events, and judgments about events. The job ending is an event. The conclusion that this event proves you are fundamentally inadequate is a judgment. The relationship dissolving is an event. The conclusion that this event reveals something permanently broken in your capacity for connection is a judgment. Epictetus was precise about where suffering actually originates. Not in the events themselves, which are simply things that occurred, but in the judgments the mind attaches to those events. Judgments that feel like facts, but are actually interpretations, made quickly, in the mind's most frightened state, and then mistaken for conclusions. What remains entirely within your control, he taught, is never the event, but always the judgment, always the meaning attached, always the response chosen. Seneca completed the picture with something that initially sounds harsh, but carries genuine precision beneath it. Hardship does not create weakness, he observed. It reveals weakness that was already quietly present. And in doing so, it offers something that comfort never could: exact information about where the foundation needs strengthening. Read that slowly, because it reframes the entire experience of feeling broken. The structure that collapsed was not destroyed by the difficulty. The difficulty simply revealed that the structure had never been as solid as it felt. It had simply never been tested at this particular level of pressure. This means the pain is not punishment. It is not evidence of failure. It is revelation, precise, specific, showing you exactly where the work of genuine strengthening needs to happen. Taken together, these three perspectives form something worth carrying forward. The heat of difficulty is the forge, not the furnace that destroys. The events that collapsed were never within your control, but the judgment you attach to them always is. And the weakness this season has revealed was always already present, waiting quietly for exactly this level of pressure to bring it into view, so that it could finally, genuinely, be strengthened into something that holds. What triggers the spiral, and when does it arrive? These two questions matter more than most people realize during a difficult season, because the spiral rarely begins with the original loss. It begins somewhere much smaller, much more ordinary. A quiet moment that most people walk straight through without ever noticing what just happened. Late at night, when the distraction has finally fallen away and the mind has nothing left to occupy itself with, the unprocessed emotion that has been waiting patiently all day simply rises to fill the silence. And within minutes, a single feeling has become an entire architecture of conclusions about who you are and what your future holds. Scrolling without direction, letting the mind drift without intention, until a single image, a single sentence from someone else's life, lands with a weight it was never designed to carry. And suddenly the comparison has done its quiet damage before any conscious awareness had a chance to intervene. A comment from someone who meant nothing particular by it, arriving at precisely the moment when the inner defenses are already low. Landing is confirmation of the worst narrative currently running. These moments are not random. They are patterned, specific to particular times of day, particular emotional conditions, particular kinds of input that consistently activate the same downward pull. Simply learning to recognize these patterns before they complete themselves without judgment, without attempting to suppress whatever surfaces, creates the first meaningful gap between trigger and spiral. And inside that gap, a question becomes available that was not available before. Am I hurting right now because of what actually happened? Or am I hurting because of the story I built around what happened? This question matters with precision, because the event and the story are never identical. The job ended. That is an event, bounded, specific, contained within particular circumstances, but the story the mind constructed around that event. This means I am fundamentally insufficient. This means my future has been permanently narrowed. This means something essential about who I am has finally been confirmed as inadequate. None of those conclusions were contained within the event itself. The mind added them, quickly, in its most frightened state, and then presented them as though they were simply part of what happened. Asking this question honestly, in the actual moment the heaviness rises, does not eliminate the pain, but it begins separating the genuine grief from the constructed narrative. And that separation is not small, because genuine grief can be processed, moved through, eventually integrated. But a narrative that has been mistaken for fact simply compounds, growing heavier with each passing day it goes unexamined. Now look at what the collapse has actually taken, and what it has not. The role disappeared. The relationship concluded. The particular shape of the future you had been imagining is no longer available. These losses are real. Nothing here minimizes them. But look more carefully at what remains. Your capacity for honest reflection, still intact. Your ability to sit with difficulty without completely fragmenting, still present. The values you held before the loss arrived, unchanged by the event that followed. Your fundamental character, the thing that was never actually housed in the title, or the relationship, or the version of the choo-choo that is now gone, still here, quietly waiting to be recognized as distinct from everything that fell away. Here is what no one tells you about healing during a difficult season. The pain itself is rarely the thing that prolongs the suffering. What prolongs it is the unexamined accumulation of everything allowed to enter while the defenses are already low. Every difficult season has a particular quality of vulnerability attached to it. The nervous system is already carrying more than usual. The mind is already working harder than it wants to acknowledge. And in that state, what gets consumed, what gets discussed, what gets allowed into the quiet hours, matters considerably more than it does during ordinary times. The first boundary begins here, with the question of what you are actually feeding this season. There is content that helps you process difficulty honestly, that creates genuine space for reflection and integration. And there is content that simply deepens the spiral, that reinforces the story of permanent inadequacy, that makes self-pity feel like self-awareness. These two things can look almost identical from the outside. Both involve thinking seriously about pain. Both feel meaningful in the moment. But one moves through the difficulty, and the other circles it indefinitely, limiting exposure to whatever consistently deepens the spiral is not avoidance of genuine emotion. It is protecting the clarity required to actually process that emotion, rather than simply marinating in it until it becomes the entire atmosphere of the season. Now consider a different kind of boundary, one that the modern world has made considerably more difficult to maintain. There is a quiet assumption running through contemporary life that healing must be visible. That difficulty must be explained, documented, shared in sufficient detail with enough people that it somehow becomes more real or more legitimate through the act of being witnessed. But genuine healing has never required an audience. Marcus Aurelius wrote his deepest reflections in private journals never intended for anyone else to read. He was not processing his most difficult seasons for public consumption. He was processing them for himself, because he understood that the work of genuine integration happens in the quiet, not in the performance of difficulty for others. Your wound does not become more real because others have witnessed it, and it does not heal faster because others have validated it. There is real strength available in choosing privacy, in allowing certain experiences to be worked through without the additional weight of managing other people's reactions to your pain while simultaneously trying to move through it yourself. And now the third boundary, the one that sits at the exact intersection of feeling and discipline. Epictetus did not ask his students to stop feeling. He asked them to examine what they believed about what they were feeling. The grief is real. The sadness is real. The disorientation of having lost something that once provided structure is completely real. But the feeling and the verdict the feeling seems to carry are not the same thing. Emotional discipline in this context does not mean suppressing what rises. It means refusing to let the feeling function as the sole authority on what is actually true. Feeling broken does not mean you are broken. Feeling like the future has narrowed does not mean the future has actually narrowed. Feeling like the loss reveals something permanent about your inadequacy does not mean that verdict is accurate. The feeling can be fully present, acknowledged, even honored for the genuine information it carries, while the conclusions the feeling wants to draw are examined carefully, rather than accepted automatically as though they had arrived from some authority outside the frightened mind that constructed them. The story you believed about yourself is breaking, not your ability to live. Hold that distinction carefully, because everything that follows depends on it. Most internal scripts offered during difficult seasons aim at comfort. They try to soften the edge of what is happening, to make the pain feel more manageable by wrapping it in language that sounds reassuring. What is being offered here is different. Not comfort, but precision. When the feeling of being broken rises most sharply, the mind needs something more specific than reassurance. It needs a clear distinction between what has actually been damaged and what has simply been revealed. The role that defined you is gone. The story built around that role is what is breaking, not the capacity that existed before the role ever arrived. The relationship that provided structure has ended. The identity constructed around being in that relationship is what is dissolving, not the person who existed before the relationship began. This is not wordplay. This is the precise distinction Epictetus pointed toward when he separated events from judgments. The event is bounded. The judgment the mind adds to the event is where the genuine damage extends. Carry this sentence into the moments when the spiral begins. What is breaking right now is a story about who I had to be, not evidence of who I actually am. Say it slowly, not as motivation, but as an act of honest examination. Because the mind that constructed the worst-case narrative did so quickly, in its most frightened state, and it deserves to be examined with the same careful attention that any claim made under extreme duress deserves. The second sentence to carry forward comes from Seneca's understanding of what adversity actually does. This difficulty is not defining my limits. It is revealing where I placed them. There is a profound difference between those two things. A limit that defines you as fixed, permanent, something to be accepted and worked around. A limit that has simply been revealed as information, precise, actionable, showing you exactly where the strengthening work needs to happen. And now the daily practice, simple enough to maintain even on the days when maintaining anything feels like too much. Each night, 2 questions, written down, without elaborate explanation. What broke today, and what did the breaking reveal? Not what did today teach me in a general sense, but specifically, what structure or story showed a crack under today's particular pressure? And what does that crack reveal about where genuine strengthening is actually needed? This practice does something the mind left to itself rarely does during difficult seasons. It trains attention toward information rather than verdict, toward what the difficulty is revealing, rather than what the difficulty is proving. Over time, these 3 things working together begin to change the fundamental relationship between this person and their own pain. The precise internal language interrupts the catastrophic story at the moment it tries to form. The Seneca reframe converts the feeling of limitation into actionable information. And the nightly practice builds a quiet, growing body of evidence that even the most difficult days are contributing to something being constructed, not simply destroyed. There was a version of you, not long ago, who met every wave of pain with the same immediate response: get away from it. Not through any conscious decision, but through a pattern so practiced it had become almost indistinguishable from instinct. Reach for the phone, fill the silence, find anything that occupies the mind thoroughly enough that the feeling has no room to surface fully. And when avoidance wasn't available, the other response took over. Accept the verdict. The broken feeling arrived and was treated as fact, as a conclusion about something permanent rather than as a signal from a frightened mind in a difficult moment. That version of you was not weak, not foolish. It was doing precisely what it had learned to do, moving away from pain as quickly as possible, because no one had ever shown it that moving through pain was survivable. Something has shifted since then. The shift did not arrive dramatically. It did not come as a single moment of revelation after which everything reorganized itself into clarity. It came quietly, through the accumulated practice of asking one honest question when the spiral began, through the repeated choice to examine the story rather than simply inhabit it, through staying present with the feeling long enough to discover that presence did not destroy anything. Now, when pain arrives, sharp, unexpected, carrying the old familiar weight, something different happens. The urge to flee still stirs, somewhere beneath the surface. The old verdict still forms at the edges of awareness, but neither takes hold the way it once did. There is a pause now, small but real, a space between the feeling arriving and the response forming. And inside that space, a question has become almost automatic. What is breaking here? And what is this breaking revealing? This is not detachment from genuine difficulty. It is not the performance of equanimity over actual pain. It is something considerably more honest than either of those. It is the capacity to feel the full weight of what is happening, while simultaneously holding a distinction that was not available before. The structure is breaking, not the person inside it. Where panic once lived in these moments, A different quality of presence has slowly taken its place. Not the absence of pain, but a changed relationship to it. Pain is no longer arriving as a verdict. It is arriving as information, as the fire Marcus Aurelius wrote about. Not consuming, but forging. And something about the future looks different from this position. Not because circumstances have improved. They may not have. But because the measurement has changed. The question is no longer whether this season is comfortable. It is whether this season is building something. There is a particular freedom that arrives when external comfort is no longer the primary requirement for feeling fundamentally secure. When the steadiness comes not from circumstances cooperating, but from the quiet, practiced knowledge that you have sat inside difficulty before, examined it honestly, and emerged from it carrying something that the easier seasons could never have produced. This is not a transformation that announces itself. It does not feel the way transformation is supposed to feel in the stories people tell about it. It feels quieter than that, more ordinary, simply the gradual recognition that the thing you were most afraid of, the breaking, was also the thing that made everything that followed possible. The moments that felt most like endings were rarely endings at all. They were the heat, the specific, necessary pressure that genuine strengthening requires. And the reason most people never discover this is not that the heat was too much to survive. It is that they left before the forging could complete. Armor is not made in comfortable conditions. It has never been made in comfortable conditions. It is made in exactly the conditions that feel, while you are inside them, like proof that something has gone permanently wrong. The job that ended, the relationship that dissolved, the silence that grew unbearable. These were not interruptions to the life you were supposed to be living. They were the forge, operating exactly as it needed to, on the exact material that required shaping. Let me leave you with a question worth sitting with quietly today. Is the brokenness you are currently carrying truly an ending? Or is it the forging process your character actually needed in order to become something that holds under real pressure? Sit with your honest answer. There is no resolution required immediately. Some questions do their most important work simply by being carried. Return to slowly, over many quiet moments, rather than answered all at once. If you wish to continue learning how to read difficulty as material rather than simply as loss, this same journey continues here, step by step. Together, stay calm, stay wise, and keep living your truth.